The rifle shot cracked across the morning range like a door slamming on something that couldn't be taken back. Vera Ashford didn't flinch. She was already face down in the mud, cheek pressed into the cold black earth, fingers loose at her sides. A boot connected with her lower back. Not hard enough to injure, hard enough to humiliate. The kind of kick you give something you've already decided doesn't matter. Get off my range. Cole Harwick's voice carried the particular confidence of a man who had never once been wrong about anything. At least not in his own telling of events. 6'2", 38 years old, 6 years as a senior instructor at Fort Davis Sniper School, and every one of those years visible in the way he stood over her, like he owned the ground she was lying in. Laughter came from behind him. His people, Garrett Spence, Les Dunbar, Roy Maddox, they laugh the way men laugh when the joke has been decided before it happens. Colonel Leland Pruitt watched from the doorway of the range office, 62 years old, 11 years running this school, coffee going cold in his hand. He had seen candidates broken on this range, good ones sometimes. People with genuine talent who simply couldn't hold themselves together when the pressure became personal. He watched the woman climb to her feet. She didn't rush, didn't wipe the mud from her face with any urgency. Just stood, found her balance, and looked at the range ahead of her with the same expression a carpenter uses when measuring a board. Something to be understood, something to be worked. Pruitt took a slow sip of cold coffee. Later, much later, he would tell people that was the moment. Not the shooting, not the night the base nearly burned. That moment right there. A woman getting up from the mud with nothing to prove and nowhere to be but exactly where she was. He didn't know it yet. That was his failure, not hers. She had left Amarillo at 4 in the morning 2 days before. 14 hours in a Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and a heater that worked when it felt like it. She drove through the flat dark of West Texas with the radio off and her hands steady on the wheel. Stopped once for gas and bad coffee outside of San Angelo. Didn't call anyone to say she was coming. There was nobody to call. Her husband Jim had been dead for 20 years. Fallujah 2004. Best spotter the Army had ever produced according to the men who had served with him, and those men did not give compliments like that freely. Vera had gotten the news on a Tuesday morning while she was teaching a room full of young soldiers how to calculate windage on a moving target. She finished the lesson, then she drove home and sat in the kitchen for a long time. She kept shooting after that, for herself, then for the Army, then for the school. 20 years of teaching others what Jim had helped her understand. That patience was not passive. That stillness was a skill. That the space between heartbeats was where everything that mattered actually happened. Then Danny. Her son had graduated from Fort Davis Sniper School 18 months ago, top of his class. His instructors had written things about him in their reports that made Vera read each sentence twice. He had his father's eyes for distance and his mother's discipline. He was 26 years old, and he was going to be something that mattered. He was killed in an ambush outside Kingsley Station 8 months after graduation. His unit was moving through a corridor they had used 4 times before, without incident. On the 5th time, the enemy was waiting at exactly the right positions, with exactly the right timing, with information that could only have come from someone who knew the route. 17 soldiers went in, 9 came out. Danny was not among the 9. The Army's investigation concluded with language Vera had read so many times she could recite it from memory. Unforeseen intelligence failure. Hostile adaptation to established patrol patterns. No evidence of internal compromise. She had submitted her own report 2 weeks after reading that conclusion. She had names, dates, a pattern of financial irregularities she had noticed during her final months as senior marksmanship instructor at Fort Davis before the knee injury that ended her tenure, before the retirement that had been encouraged rather than chosen. Her report was acknowledged. Then it was filed. Then it was buried somewhere between a filing cabinet and the end of someone's attention span. That was 2 years ago. She had spent those 2 years being quiet and thorough and patient in the way that only people with nothing left to lose can manage. Then she drove 14 hours to Fort Davis, checked in under a name that was technically hers on enlistment papers that were technically valid, and put on a uniform 2 sizes too large. Nobody recognized her. That was the point. The mess hall at Fort Davis opened at 04:30. Vera was the 3rd person through the door. She chose the corner table farthest from the entrance, back to the wall sight lines to every door and window. She set her tray down, poured coffee that smelled like it had been made yesterday, and began to eat with the methodical focus of someone fueling an engine. She wasn't there to enjoy breakfast. The other candidates filtered in over the next half hour, 40 of them eventually, 41 including Vera, young mostly, mid-20s to mid-30s. the kind of physical condition that made her knee ache in sympathy just watching them move. They came in loud, comparing gear and units, and confirmed range scores, the social positioning that happens whenever competitive people are put in a room together and told to wait. She watched all of it from her corner and said nothing. Cole Harwick arrived at 05:05 with his group arranged behind him like punctuation marks. He moved through the mess hall the way water moves through a landscape, finding the path of least resistance, which in this case meant the center of the room, the loudest table, the position of maximum visibility. He was good-looking in the specific way that institutions reward. Broad, clean, authoritative. The kind of man who had been told he was exceptional for long enough that he had stopped being able to distinguish between confidence and certainty. He noticed Vera on his second pass of the room. She watched him notice her without letting him know she was watching. A skill that, one of many she had stopped counting. He said something to Garrett Spence that she couldn't hear at this distance. Spence laughed. Then Harwick was walking toward her table with the stride of a man who has decided a conversation is already won. He stopped beside her, looked down. She kept eating. You lost. The voice was pleasant. Almost. The pleasantness of someone who doesn't need to raise it. Supply depots that way. This is for candidates. Vera took a sip of her coffee, set the cup down with care. I'm aware, she said. Something moved through Harwick's expression. Not quite surprise. More like recalibration. He had expected either submission or defiance, and she had given him neither. Just a flat statement of fact delivered with the same energy you'd use to report the weather. He reached out and flipped her tray. Coffee, scrambled eggs, a single piece of toast, all of it across the front of her uniform in a moment that produced exactly the response he had engineered. Every head in the mess hall turning a beat of silence, then laughter spreading from his table outward like a stone dropped in still water. Vera sat perfectly still for 3 seconds. Then she stood, picked up the empty tray, and walked to the cleanup station. No hurry, no visible anger. The movements of someone completing a task that needed completing. As she passed the long table where Harwick's group had settled, her eyes moved across the room in a single sweep. Not dramatic, just a woman looking at a space. But she had counted entrances, logged positions, noted the way Boyd Strickland, the range director, standing near the coffee station, with his clipboard, had watched the tray incident with an expression that was almost satisfied. Almost, that was the word she filed next to his name. At 05:30:41, candidates walked to the range. Vera walked at the back of the group alone and used the 20 minutes to study the facility she had known well and now needed to see fresh. The layout of Building 31, the maintenance ladder on its north face, the gap in the perimeter berm at grid 447 that the construction crews had left when they redirected a drainage channel 3 years ago. She had done her research. The armorer was a master sergeant named Calhoun Briggs, 64 years old, wide in the shoulders with a knee that had been rebuilt twice and a gait that showed it. He handed out rifle assignments with the efficiency of long practice. Good equipment to the front of the line, older equipment to the back. Vera received serial number 13. Barrett Narrated 82, a rifle that had seen things. The barrel showed wear patterns consistent with approximately 40,000 rounds fired without replacement. The scope mount had been adjusted so many times that the screws had stripped slightly at their threads. The ammunition allocation, 3 boxes, came from 3 different manufacturing lots. 3 different powder loads, 3 different pressure curves, 3 different trajectories. Any real sniper would know what that meant. Strickland watched her accept the rifle. There was that almost satisfaction again, sitting on his face like he'd forgotten to take it off. Vera carried the rifle to Station 13. Far right of the range, full morning sun in her face, crosswind amplified by the gap in the blast barriers, a concrete wall that would trap her spent brass and powder residue into a personal cloud with every shot. She set the rifle down on the bench and ran both hands along it slowly, starting at the stock, moving forward, checking for function, for damage, for the dozens of small variables that determine whether a given weapon could be trusted. Her fingers stopped at the barrel. 2 seconds. Then she continued. Sloan Rafferty was setting up at Station 12, close enough to observe. 29 years old, contained and watchful, with the kind of stillness that suggested she had learned to move carefully in spaces where she wasn't entirely welcome. She had watched Vera's hands the way someone watches a thing that doesn't quite fit the category it's been assigned. Station 13 gets the worst of the crosswind, she said. Not an observation, a warning. I know, Vera said. She began separating her ammunition by lot number, sorting each round by hand into 3 distinct groups, then arranging them in a specific loading order. It looked to anyone watching casually like a woman fussing with her gear. organizing things the way people organize when they're anxious. Harwick called out from 2 stations down. Something about nail polish. His group laughed on cue. Vera loaded her rifle. The qualification began at 0600, 100 yards to start. The distances that separate real from pretend would come later. But 100 yards told you certain things. It told you about fundamentals, about breath, about the relationship between a person and the instrument in their hands. Harwick went first. He made a production of it. The adjustments performed loudly enough to be observed. The breathing controlled with theatrical deliberateness. He fired 10 rounds with the confidence of a man who knew the outcome before it happened because he had arranged the outcome in advance. The best rifle, the best ammunition, the best position on the range, and 6 years of practice at exactly this distance. 10 shots, 10 bullseyes. He stood, arms wide. His group responded appropriately. Vera took her position. She spent 3 minutes adjusting her scope. This produced commentary from Harwick's end of the range. 3 minutes being apparently evidence of incompetence rather than methodology. She ignored it. The scope needed 3 minutes because the mount had stripped threads and a stripped mount required careful work rather than fast work. Then she fired. 7 hits out of 10, spread across the target in a pattern that confirmed to every observer exactly what they had assumed about her. Calhoun Briggs was walking back from downrange. He stopped at station 13, raised his spotting scope, looked for a long moment. He moved to his own position, said nothing to anyone, but he took a small notebook from his breast pocket and wrote something in it. Later, if you had looked through that spotting scope yourself, you would have seen what Briggs had seen. The 7 hits were not spread, they were stacked. Each bullet through the same exit wound, a grouping so tight it read as a single hole offset slightly from center. The 3 misses were something else entirely. The bullets had tumbled in flight, leaving keyhole-shaped marks on the target, the signature of ammunition that had failed, not a shooter who had. She had known which 3 rounds were defective. She had loaded them, fired them last, and let them fail at a distance where their failure was survivable. Strickland observed the target from his position and saw 7 scattered hits and 3 misses, and wrote a note on his clipboard. He saw exactly what Vera needed him to see. At 0700, the qualification moved to 500 yards. The wind had picked up, 17 knots gusting to 22. This was where the pretense of the morning was stripped away and what remained was real. Real skill or the absence of it. Real nerve or performance where nerve should have been. Harwick's group held their own. They were genuinely good, these men. Vera had never doubted that. Being good and being right are not the same thing, but they are easy to confuse from a distance, and Harwick had spent years making that confusion work in his favor. At one point during the 500-yard stage, Strickland walked past Station 13 and let his boot catch the bipod leg of Vera's rifle as it rested in position. A stumble, an accident, entirely plausible. The shot went wide. Vera reset, began her breathing cycle from the start. The 42 count, the pattern Jim had taught her in a field outside their first posting 28 years ago. 4 minutes had passed by the time she was ready again. She had 9 shots remaining and 8 minutes on the clock. She used 7 of them. 8 hits out of the remaining 9 in conditions that had cost Harwick's best shooter 2 misses on the same stage with a rifle that had never been touched. Harwick didn't say anything for a moment. Then lucky. He said it quietly, almost to himself, as if naming it would contain it. At 0930 during the rifle cleaning break, Harwick cornered Vera behind the equipment shed. He was not alone. Spence stood to her left, Maddox to her right, close enough that the message was physical before it was verbal. Accidents happen on ranges, Harwick said. His voice was still pleasant, still unhurried. Would be a real shame if someone got hurt, because they didn't know when to step back. Vera's eyes moved without her head moving. Door 12 feet, gap between Spence and the wall 16 inches. She cataloged these things the way you catalog the weather. Not because you intend to use the information immediately, but because you are the kind of person who keeps track. Harwick reached it out and gripped her right forearm. His thumb found the long scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow, pale against tan skin, old enough to have faded to something almost clean. He pressed into it. The particular cruelty of finding a person's history and using it as a weapon. Something moved in Vera's eyes then. Not fear. The opposite of fear. Something colder and more considered. The look of a person who has already calculated the cost of every available outcome and found them all acceptable. Harwick felt it. He released her arm and took a half step back before he registered that he'd done it. "Clean your rifle," he said. She did. Inside the armory, she broke the rifle down in 12 seconds flat. The other candidates nearby noticed. Spence noticed, but decided not to examine what noticing meant. At 1400, the afternoon brought advanced ballistics testing. Candidates had to calculate complex shots accounting for wind elevation, humidity, barometric pressure. Most pulled out calculators and reference cards. Vera wrote her solutions directly on the worksheet. No calculator, no references, just neat rows of equations that included corrections most snipers didn't encounter until advanced school. When she factored in the Magnus effect on spindrift, Briggs stopped walking past and looked at the paper for a moment. He said nothing, but he wrote in his notebook again. Her formula included a correction factor developed 3 years ago by a specialized Army marksmanship unit. No civilian reference would have it. She noticed Briggs noticing. She looked slightly flustered. Moved on to the next calculation. The damage was already done in the way she intended. Owen Taggart found her at 15:30 during afternoon gear check. He was 24, serious in the way that young men are serious when they have experienced something that ended their tolerance for foolishness. He spoke quickly, quietly, with the urgency of someone who had made a decision and was afraid of losing his nerve before it was delivered. He told her about the night exercise, the bunker at Grid 372, Harwick's plan, Strickland's plan, the evidence that would be planted in her locker, the discharge papers waiting by morning. He told her because he had a brother who had died in a hazing incident at 22 years old, because he had watched all day and reached a conclusion about what kind of person Vera Ashford was, because some things you do simply because they need doing. When he finished, she looked at him. "I know," she said. He stared at her. "I know about the bunker, Owen. I need you to stay with the main group tonight. Keep Sloan with you. You're going to be a witness, just not for what they're expecting." She pressed a flashlight into his hand. "Secondary power source, fresh batteries, military standard." "Your brother would recognize what you're doing right now," she said. Owen Taggart went pale in the specific way of people who have been seen accurately. He wanted to ask how she knew. He could see she wasn't going to answer. He took the flashlight and walked away and didn't look back. At 1700, Vera returned to her bunk for 1 hour. She sat on the edge of the mattress and took a small notebook from her breast pocket. The cover was leather, worn smooth at the corners. She opened it to the last written page. 6 names, a neat column. The first name had a line through it. Red ink, Danny Ashford. She looked at the remaining 5 for a moment. Then she closed the notebook, put it back in her pocket, rose and began checking her gear for the night exercise. Chemical lights, paracord, a small pry bar folded into the lining of her kit bag, a monocular barely larger than a lipstick case, and the modified communications device disguised as a standard GPS unit. The authorization code she had been given by a man 3 pay grades above Boyd Strickland, who had read her report 2 years ago and quietly kept a door unlocked rather than nailed shut. Code 77 Alpha. She had hoped not to need it. She prepared for the strong possibility that she would. Through the barracks window, the sun was going down over Fort Davis, painting the rifle range in long orange shadows. Somewhere out there, Cole Harwick was setting up a trap he believed was original. Boyd Strickland was updating his clipboard with a plan he believed was clean. Vera Ashford laced up her boots, duct tape holding the right sole, a detail she had chosen deliberately. She stood. Outside, 40 other candidates were preparing for the same night exercise. None of them knew what was coming with the dark. Neither did Pruitt, still in his office reviewing the day's scoring sheets, frowning at a column of numbers that didn't quite add up to the picture he'd been given. She walked out into the cooling evening, and the last light caught her face for just a moment. Something in her expression that was not quite peace but was adjacent to it. The look of a person who has carried something heavy for a long time and can finally see the place where they will be allowed to set it down. She had 14 hours left. She intended to use all of them. The night exercise began at 2,000 hours. 41 candidates spread into the dark like water, finding its level. Each one following the route marked on their map, each one trusting the equipment they had been issued, each one moving toward checkpoints, set in advance by instructors who had done this 100 times before. Vera walked to the edge of the tree line and stopped. She stood there for 30 seconds, not hesitating, listening. The way you listen when you already know something is wrong and are simply confirming the nature of it. The wind moving through the pines. The distant sound of boots on gravel fading as the other candidates dispersed. Somewhere to the north, an owl making its single inquiry of the night and getting no answer. She took her compass out, held it level, watched the needle settle, 30 degrees off. She put it back in her pocket and looked up at the sky instead. Clear enough, The stars she needed were where they had always been indifferent to the various plans of men and women below them. She found her bearing the way Jim had taught her in the field outside their first posting long ago, when he had said that instruments were fine until they weren't, and the sky had been there longer than either of them. She entered the tree line. Not on the marked road. Parallel to it, 15 meters west, moving through the dark with the particular quiet of someone who has spent a great deal of time not being heard. The trap at grid 372 had been set with care. Harwick had arrived there at 1845, giving himself time to position his people correctly. Spence on the north approach, Maddox covering the east, Dunbar at the bunker door itself, which stood open on its rusted hinges, exhaling the cold smell of 60 years of disuse. The plan was clean, simple, the kind of plan that works when all the variables behave themselves. Vera was not a cooperative variable. At 2030, she was 50 meters from the bunker, 8 meters up in the fork of a white oak, watching through the monocular she had carried since afternoon. The moonlight was adequate, not generous, but adequate. She could see Harwick at the center of the clearing, checking his watch with the impatience of a man whose certainty is beginning to cost him comfort. She counted. Harwick, Spence, Dunbar, Maddox. Owen Taggart was not among them. She allowed herself one small acknowledgement of that. Then she put it away and focused on what came next. She could have gone around. The route deviation would have added 40 minutes in a degree of difficulty that her knee would have charged interest on. But achievable. She had the terrain mapped in her memory well enough to navigate without the compromised compass. She chose not to go around. There are moments in long operations where you can take the safe path and let the patient work, continue slowly correctly at a pace that minimizes exposure. Vera understood this. She had spent 2 years on exactly that kind of path. But Strickland had a phone call scheduled for tomorrow morning. She had intercepted the scheduling of it 3 weeks ago through a chain of inference that had taken 11 days to complete. After that call, the next name on her list, a young sergeant currently stationed at Camp Lejeune, would be moving to a new assignment, a new route, a new exposure. She needed Strickland in custody before that call, which meant tonight had to be the night, and the night had to go a specific way, and going around the bunker was not part of that specific way. She climbed down from the tree and made enough noise on her approach to be heard. She walked into the clearing like someone who had taken a wrong turn and was trying not to show it. Harwick came out of the shadow at the tree line before she had crossed half the clearing. Well, he looked genuinely pleased, the pleasure of a plan arriving at its expected conclusion. Right on time. She said nothing. Spence materialized on her left, Maddox on her right. Dunbar stayed at the bunker door, which said something about his particular role in the architecture of cruelty. Not the instrument of it, but the stage manager. Harwick took her rifle, not roughly, with the casual certainty of someone repossessing something that was never really hers to begin with. The bunker door was 3 meters away. Open, the darkness inside was the absolute kind offering no compromise between sight and blindness. She let them move her toward it. She did not resist. She did not perform distress. At the door she stopped, turned, found Harwick's face in the moonlight. "Stay together tonight, Cole," she said. "All 4 of you, don't separate." He looked at her the way you look at something that has said something unexpected in a moment that was supposed to be entirely yours. "Is that a threat?" "It's the only useful advice I have left to give you," she said. "Take it or don't." She stepped into the dark. The door swung shut behind her. The locking bar dropped into place with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Outside, she heard Harwick say something. His people laughed. Their voices faded as they moved to their waiting positions, confident the problem was solved. Inside, Vera stood perfectly still and let her eyes begin their adjustment. She was not afraid of the dark. She had made a long and deliberate peace with it some years ago, under circumstances she did not often revisit. She began to work. The lock was a Simplex 900 series, 40 years old, possibly more. She had known what type it was because she had reviewed the maintenance logs for Training Area 7 during her research. The maintenance logs for facilities like this one were the kind of document nobody updates because nobody reads them, which meant they were also the kind of document that told the truth. She fashioned the pick from wire carried in the lining of her kit bag. Her hands worked in complete darkness, navigating by touch and by the accumulated memory of a great deal of practice in a great deal of bad conditions. 4 minutes and 18 seconds. The door opened. She stood in the entry and listened to the night for 10 seconds before she moved. An old habit, a good one. She could hear Maddox to the east, his breathing not quite as controlled as he probably believed. She had perhaps 12 minutes before someone checked the door. She began moving toward the arms room at grid 447. She had covered perhaps 200 meters when the first explosion happened. It was not a training charge. There is a particular quality to ordnance that has genuine intent behind it. A pressure in the air, a depth to the sound that training simulations approach but never quite reach. This sound had intent. It came from the direction of the perimeter Sector 7, and it was followed immediately by the specific chatter of automatic weapons fire. Not the controlled, measured fire of a range exercise. The sustained, overlapping fire of a coordinated assault. Vera stopped walking. She stood in the dark for 3 full seconds processing. Then the base sirens began. FPCON Delta. The highest threat condition. The one they tested once a year and hoped never to use. The one that meant the fence had been crossed. Her modified communications device activated in her hand. The emergency channel crackled with voices stripping away protocol. All units, all units. This is not a drill. Multiple hostiles inside the wire Sector 7 moving toward the ammunition depot. Base security is engaged. Casualties reported. All non-essential personnel to shelter positions. Repeat, this is not a drill. Somewhere behind her, she heard Harwick's radio deliver the same message to 4 men standing in a dark clearing with no ammunition and no plan for this particular contingency. She thought of the advice she had given him. Stay together. She hoped he had the sense to take it. Then she turned back and moved faster through the trees because there were things that needed doing and the clock was running. The arms room at grid 447 was a concrete block building constructed in 1978 for reasons the Army no longer clearly remembered. The duty sergeant, a man named Tolliver, who had been expecting a quiet overnight shift, was standing in the doorway when Vera arrived, drawn out by the sirens, his face carrying the expression of a person who had prepared for the wrong emergency. He raised a hand when he saw her approaching. Range is locked down. No access without code 77 Alpha, Vera said. Tolliver looked at her. Then he looked at something on his terminal inside the door. His face underwent a series of small changes that ended somewhere in the vicinity of understanding the way faces look when they receive information that rearranges the categories they have been using. He stepped back from the door. She went past him into the arms room. The modern rifles were on the left. Current issue, well-maintained, the kind of equipment Harwick's group had been handed that morning while she received serial number 13. She walked past all of them. At the back of the room on a lower rack there was a case that had not been opened recently. The dust on the latch was undisturbed. The case itself was standard military transit. Olive drab reinforced corners. She opened it. The rifle inside was a .308 bolt action worn in the specific way that only comes from use rather than age. The stock had been refinished once badly and then left alone. The scope was older than most of the candidates on the range. It was by any objective measure not the most impressive weapon in the room. Vera ran her hands along it the way you greet something that has been waiting for you. She began loading with the focus of a person who has reduced all variables to the ones they can control. At the door, Tolliver was watching her. Behind him, out in the dark, she could hear approaching boots. Harwick and his group moving toward the only lit building in the training area. They arrived in a state that was for all 4 of them probably the most genuinely uncertain they had felt in years. Harwick's confidence had been designed for specific conditions. These were not those conditions. He looked at Vera loading a rifle in an arms room she had no business accessing, and the categories he had been using all day were failing him. You need to stay here, she said without looking up. Guard this room. Nobody gets a weapon who isn't confirmed friendly. Do you understand? Nobody said anything for a moment. What's happening? Harwick asked. 12 to 15 hostiles, Sector 7. Moving for the depot. Base security is pinned. She worked the bolt. Checked the chamber. There are wounded in the open who can't be reached while the gun team has that angle. She looked at him directly. First time all day, she had done that with any intention behind it. Guard the room, Cole. She walked out into the dark and was gone before anyone thought to argue. Harwick stood in the doorway and watched the darkness where she had been. Then he turned around and took up a position inside the door. Spence and Maddox flanked without being asked. Dunbar covered the back. They were without quite understanding how it had happened, following orders from the woman they had locked in a bunker 40 minutes ago. Building 31 was 400 meters from the arms room, moving northeast through open ground that offered no cover and several different angles of exposure. Vera moved quickly and low, using the terrain breaks where they existed and accepting the exposure where they didn't. The maintenance ladder on the north face was where she had noted it that morning, cold under her hands, 19 rungs to the roof. She climbed, one-handed rifle slung across her back, favoring her right side. Her left knee had been building its complaint for the last hour, stiffening in the cold the way it had done every winter since the surgery. She had been managing it the way she managed most physical inconvenience, by acknowledging it and continuing. She came over the parapet onto the graveled roof and moved immediately to the southeast corner. She built her position in 20 seconds. No sandbags, no bipod, just her body arranged against the parapet with the geometry of long practice. Her weight distributed her breathing, beginning its long, deliberate descent toward the pattern she needed. She found the tree line through the scope. Sector 7 was 300 meters of open ground between the perimeter fence and the first line of storage facilities. The hostiles had breached at the northeast corner and were moving in two elements: a fire team providing suppression against the base security response and a maneuver element pushing toward the ammunition depot. The base security teams were pinned behind two vehicles. She could see the wounded, two of them motionless in the open between the vehicles and the tree line, too exposed to retrieve while the suppression was active. She found the enemy sniper first. He was good, properly concealed in the tree line, disciplined in his rate of fire. He had the two security teams manage their heads down, their ability to move or communicate with their wounded reduced to something below useful. Vera settled. The distance was 790 yards. Wind from the southwest running at 22 knots with irregular gusts she had been cataloging since she cleared the parapet. The temperature had dropped 3 degrees since sunset. She did not hurry. This was the thing that people who had never done this work did not understand about it. The urgency was real. The wounded men needed to be reached. The assault needed to be broken. All of this was true and present and pressing. And none of it changed what the work required, which was the complete absence of hurry in the moment of execution. She waited for a gust to pass, found the natural pause between her heartbeats, placed the crosshair where it needed to be. She fired. The rifle made a sound like a door closing quietly in another room. At 790 yards, the enemy sniper stopped moving. She displaced 6 meters to the left. Never fire twice from the same position. Never let the smoke settle where you were. She found the gun team, 2 men working a belt-fed weapon from behind a fuel storage unit, the angle giving them coverage of the main gate approach. The gunner was traversing left, establishing a new field of fire that would cut off the reinforcement route. She led him by calculation. 791 yards adjusted for the traversal rate she had observed over 15 seconds. The wind gusted at the wrong moment, and she waited, watching the pattern, and when the gust broke, she was already in the follow-through. The gunner dropped mid-traverse. His assistant moved to take the weapon. Vera fired again before the man's hands found the grip. Then she was moving, a different corner, a different angle. The enemy commander was trying to consolidate. She found him in the open between two positions, doing the work of leadership under fire. Moving, directing, making the best of a situation that had abruptly stopped going according to plan. He was on a radio calling for extraction. The assault had lost too much momentum too fast. 905 yards. The rain had arrived in the last 10 minutes, light but steady, and the wind had shifted 4 degrees. She settled into the position and found the stillness. She was not detached from what she was doing. She was present, completely, precisely present, in the way a surgeon is present, in the way anyone is present when the stakes are high enough that the luxury of being anywhere else in your mind has been removed. She fired. Then she tracked the remaining 3 hostiles as they broke for the tree line, worked the bolt with the rhythm that had lived in her hands for 30 years. 3 shots. 3 men who did not reach the trees. Silence spread across Sector 7, like something physical filling the space the gunfire had occupied. In the distance, helicopters. The quick reaction force arriving to a fight that was already over. She sat back against the parapet. Her left knee had given out on the 11th shot. She had felt it go, the joint buckling without warning, and she had gone down on the gravel and taken a moment to find her stability, and then continued because there was one target left and the knee could file its complaint afterward. It was filing it now. She heard it. She reached into her breast pocket. The notebook was damp at the corner, but the leather had done its work and the pages were intact. She opened it to the last written page and looked at the 6 names in the careful column. Danny Ashford with his line through it. The 5 names below his, and all 5 still standing tonight. She became aware of her own breathing. The 42 count still running. She let it run. "I'm sorry it took this long," she said. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way you say something that has been waiting to be said and finally has the space to exist. She sat in the rain and let that be enough for a moment. Then she closed the notebook, picked up the rifle, keyed the communications device. Sector 7 is clear. Recommend recovery teams immediately. Wounded personnel require extraction. She stood, put weight on the left knee, and accepted what it told her. Functional for now. That was the relevant category. She climbed back down the maintenance ladder in the rain. The arms room was still secured when she returned. Harwick, Spence, Dunbar, and Maddox were inside. Owen Taggart had arrived sometime in the last 30 minutes, the flashlight she had given him still in his hand. Sloane Rafferty stood near the back wall. They all looked at Vera when she came through the door. At the rifle, at the rain on her face and the gravel dust on her hands, and the way she was managing her left side with the care of someone who has accepted an injury as a working condition. She set the rifle on the counter. Cleared and safed, 14 rounds expended. Tolliver nodded. His hands were not entirely steady. She turned to the room. Harwick was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face all day. Not the managed certainty of the morning. Not the performed authority of the afternoon. Something that had been underneath all of that, waiting for the conditions that would surface it. He was trying to understand what he had been looking at all day and the failing was visible in ways he had no practice concealing. "Report to Colonel Pruitt's office at 0600, she said. "All of you, including Taggart, including Rafferty." A pause. "You did your job tonight," she said. "The room was guarded. Nobody got hurt who came here for help. That matters." She walked out into the rain and left them with that. Because sometimes the most useful thing you can give people who have spent a day being wrong about something is a single true sentence to carry forward into the accounting that comes next. In the Tactical Operations Center, Colonel Leland Pruitt was watching the security footage from Building 31. The camera quality was not generous at that distance in the rain, but it was adequate. He had watched the figure on the roof acquire and engage and displace and acquire again, with a rhythm that his 11 years running this school told him was not something you learned. It was something you earned over a span of time and at a cost the footage could not convey. He pulled the arms room access log. 14 rounds expended, weapon returned, cleared, and safed. He looked at the serial number of the weapon, then looked at it again. He had a call to make. Not a call he had expected, not one he particularly wanted, because making it would require saying certain things out loud, and once said they became real in a way that changed the shape of what came next. He made it anyway. While the phone rang, he thought about the footage, the spacing between shots, an old rhythm, something he had seen once in an after-action analysis that had been classified, then reclassified, then filed in a place most people didn't know to look. He had looked, because looking was fundamentally what his job required. The phone was answered on the second ring. "Sir," Pruitt said, "I need you to see something." Outside, the rain continued. The helicopters had landed and the quick reaction force was moving through Sector 7. Somewhere on the base, Boyd Strickland was in his office, aware that something had gone differently than planned, not yet understanding how differently. Vera Ashford was walking toward the barracks in the rain, her notebook dry in her breast pocket. The morning was 6 hours away. She intended to be ready for it. The rain stopped at 02:30. Vera knew because she had been awake when it stopped. Not from anxiety, from the particular wakefulness that follows sustained action. The body still running its checks, cataloging what had been spent, calculating what remained. She lay on the narrow bunk and looked at the ceiling and let her mind do what it needed to do. Her knee had swollen. Not dramatically, but enough. She had wrapped it with the compression bandage from her kit and elevated it on her folded jacket and accepted that the next several weeks were going to involve a conversation with a doctor she had been postponing for the better part of 2 years. She thought about Jim, not in the way she used to in the first years after Fallujah, when thinking about him had the quality of touching a wound. She thought about him the way she thought about him now, which was more like consulting a compass, orienting herself against something that didn't move. He would have understood tonight. He would have understood all of it. The 2 years of quiet work, the manufactured incompetence, the patience required to let people believe exactly what they needed to believe until their belief became the mechanism of their own undoing. He had been that kind of person, the kind who played the long game, not because they enjoyed it, but because they understood that some problems could not be solved any faster than they could be solved. He would also have had something dry and precisely accurate to say about her knee. She almost smiled. At 04:30, she rose dressed, wrapped the knee with fresh compression, and went to the mess hall. Back to the wall. Sight lines to every entrance. Coffee that had not improved overnight. 2 hours before the accounting began. She used them to be ready. Colonel Pruitt's conference room held 6 people at 0600. Pruitt at the head, Calhoun Briggs to his left, an empty chair to his right, Harwick, Spence, Dunbar, and Maddox across one side of the table, sitting with the careful posture of men who had spent the hours between midnight and dawn doing the kind of thinking that rearranges how you sit in a chair. Owen Taggart at the far end, Sloane Rafferty beside him. Vera entered at 0600 exactly. She had changed into a clean uniform. The captain's bars were on her collar. Not the recruit's insignia she had worn for the previous 20 hours, but her actual rank pressed and correct. Among her service ribbons, if you knew what to look for, was a small rectangle of red, white, and blue that carried more weight than everything else on the uniform combined. Most of the people in the room didn't know what to look for. Calhoun Briggs knew. She moved to the front of the room without being invited and stood facing the table. No theater, no ceremony. Harwick looked at the bars on her collar and then looked at her face, and the recalibration that had been happening since midnight completed itself visibly. "You have questions," Vera said. "Some will be answered this morning. Some are above the classification level of everyone in this room, including me. I'll tell you which is which." Nobody spoke. Cole Harwick. He straightened without thinking about it. "Your reduction in rank is effective as of 0500 this morning. You'll serve a minimum of 6 months as a private under Sergeant Major Briggs, during which time you will complete every leadership course this installation offers. Not pass through them. Complete them." Harwick's jaw was set in the way of a man absorbing something he had decided to absorb correctly. "You have genuine leadership capacity," Vera continued. "It has been pointed at the wrong things. The difference between what you were doing yesterday and what leadership actually requires is not a small difference. It is the entire difference. Briggs will show you what it looks like." She moved her eyes to Spence and Dunbar. "Discharge, both of you, effective this week." She said it without apology because apology would have been the wrong currency. "Not because you lack ability, because you have demonstrated a consistent pattern of following without thinking, and in this work that pattern gets people killed." She looked at Maddox. "Dishonorable discharge. The conduct with the brake lines was not hazing. It was sabotage of a vehicle in an active training environment. Someone could have been seriously hurt. That someone being me does not make it less serious." Maddox looked at the table. She let the silence sit. Then she looked at Owen Taggart. "Specialist Taggart, promotion effective immediately. I am recommending you for Ranger School on the earliest available cycle." Owen looked up. "Your brother recognized something about service that a lot of people with more experience haven't managed to find," she said. "You demonstrated last night that you've been paying attention to the right things. Don't waste it." His eyes filled. He held it together by the slim margin that young men hold things together when the margin is very slim. She looked at Sloane Rafferty. "You have the instincts, the attention. Trust it and train it. This school is the right place for you. Don't let yesterday's atmosphere convince you it's representative." Then she stepped back slightly, which was the signal that the formal portion was concluding. "The rest of what you witnessed last night is classified above the level I can address in this room. What I can tell you is this. The men you engaged against last night were not random. They had specific information about this base. Patrol routes, response times, security protocols. That information came from someone inside this installation." The room was very still. "That someone is Boyd Strickland." She placed the USB drive on the table in front of Pruitt. "Standard issue, unremarkable." What it contained was 2 years of work compressed into 37 files. Financial records, communication, intercepts, timeline correlations, a chain of inference so carefully documented that each link could be examined and verified independently. Pruitt picked it up. "Boyd Strickland's financial records," she said. "Cryptocurrency transfers. $47,000 over 14 months distributed across 6 separate wallets to prevent pattern detection. I have mapped all 6, traced each wallet through 3 layers of exchange platforms to the accounts that received the final transfers. The work took 11 weeks. She clicked to the first file on the display. A timeline. Dates on the left. Events on the right. The dates in the left column were the dates of Strickland's financial transactions. The events in the right column were the dates that graduates of Fort Davis Sniper School had been killed in ambushes, where the tactical situation was inconsistent with available intelligence. The 2 columns aligned with the precision of things that are not coincidental. Pruitt looked at the screen for a long time. "How long have you known?" he said. "I submitted a report 2 years ago identifying the pattern. At that time, I had the financial correlation, but not the complete communication chain. The report was filed and not acted on." Pruitt said, "I know. After that, I was encouraged to retire." "I know that too." The acknowledgement sat in the room between them. Pruitt was 62 years old and had spent those years trying to be a man who did things correctly. The knowledge that something had been done incorrectly on his watch carried a weight that showed in the set of his shoulders. "I came back because the network wasn't finished," Vera said. "Strickland is one node. The USB contains evidence identifying 13 others across 4 installations. I needed him in custody before a communication scheduled for this morning that would have moved the next target. She looked at Pruitt directly. There are 5 names on a list in my pocket. Those 5 people are alive this morning, partly because of what happened last night and partly because of 2 years of work that nobody in this room asked me to do. I am not saying that to claim credit. I am saying it so that when this goes up the chain, someone understands what the work actually cost and what it was for. Pruitt set the USB down. Where is Strickland now? Parking lot B. He attempted to leave the installation at 0447. Owen Taggart is currently sitting on him. Strickland was in the parking lot with his hands behind him. Owen crouched beside him with the uncomplicated physical authority of a 24-year-old who has decided something needs handling and has handled it. Sloan Rafferty stood 10 feet away, phone recording. When Vera arrived with 2 MPs behind her, Strickland looked up at her with the expression of a man who has been wrong about something fundamental for a long time and has just received that information at high velocity. You submitted a report, he said, 2 years ago. I had it buried. I know, that's in the USB as well. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost recognition of what she had done, the scope of it, the patience it required. Then his face went neutral. The MPs took him. Vera watched the car leave the parking lot and stood in the early morning for a moment. In the gray light that precedes sunrise in high flat country, the light coming from everywhere at once, the world revealing itself gradually. Her knee reported in. She told it she had heard. She walked back inside. The formal debrief lasted 90 minutes. General Ross Whitfield arrived by helicopter at 07:15, still in flight gear, and walked into the conference room with the bearing of a man who had been briefed in the air and had spent the flight organizing what he knew into what needed to happen next. His eyes found Vera first. They had not seen each other in 4 months. They did not embrace. They did not perform the reunion the room might have expected. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them that required none of the apparatus of public expression. Status, he said. Strickland is in custody. The USB is with Pruitt. 13 additional nodes identified. The network's next scheduled communication was at 800 this morning. We have approximately 40 minutes to decide how to handle the intercept. Whitfield looked at Pruitt. Get me a secure line. Pruitt left the room. Whitfield sat down across from Vera. They were alone for the moment. The MPs were processing Strickland. The institutional machinery had begun its engagement with the situation. Vera had kept the name Ashford when they married 4 years after Jim's death. Operational reasons partly. The name was on her credentials, her history, the invisible infrastructure of a career, but mostly because Danny had been born in Ashford, and she had not been ready to be anything else while she was still raising him. Whitfield had understood. He was that kind of man. Your knee, he said now, manageable. That's not what I asked. It's what I have, she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has had this particular conversation many times and has never found a version that ends differently. The 13 additional nodes, he said, across 4 installations, Fort Benning, Pendleton, Bragg, and Lejeune. The chain is complete enough to prosecute if the institutional will exist to prosecute it. It will exist. I know, that's why I came back. Outside the conference room window, the sun had cleared the horizon. The range was visible from this angle. Station 13, far right, concrete wall behind it. In the morning light, it looked exactly like what it was, a place where hard things were practiced, so that when the hard things arrived in their real form, they could be met with something that had been earned. How long this time? Whitfield asked. The question was not about duration exactly. It was about when the work would be done, when the list would have no names left to protect. The 13 nodes will take time to process, she said. After that, there are secondary connections, people who knew and enabled without directly participating. That's not an answer. No, she said, it isn't. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has learned that certain negotiations cannot be won and has not made peace with that knowledge, but has arrived at a working relationship with it. You could stop. We have other people now. Other people didn't trace 14 months of distributed transactions to 6 separate wallets. I'm not irreplaceable. I'm just the person who's already done the work. He looked at the table, then back at her. Are you all right? He asked. And the question arrived differently than she expected. Not as a tactical inquiry about operational readiness. As a question from a man who had been married to her for 19 years and had spent a significant portion of those years watching her carry things he was not permitted to carry for her. She considered it honestly. I told Danny I was sorry last night, she said. On the roof. That was the first time I've said that out loud. Whitfield was quiet. It helped, she said. I don't know exactly what that means, but it helped. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a gesture of comfort exactly, more like acknowledgement, recognizing something that had been waiting, treating it with the seriousness it deserved. She turned her hand over and held his for a moment. Then Pruitt knocked and opened the door and the work resumed. Calhoun Briggs found Vera in the medical bay at 0930, sitting in the waiting area with her boot off and her knee wrapped in something more professional than field compression. She had just finished with the doctor who had said what she expected him to say and recommended what she expected him to recommend. Briggs lowered himself into the plastic chair beside her with the deliberateness of someone who has learned to negotiate with his own body. He sat for a moment without speaking. I served with Jim, he said finally. 2 tours. He was the best I ever worked with. I know, Vera said. He talked about you. Briggs looked at his hands. Fallujah was partly my fault, he said. I had the angle. I should have Calhoun. He stopped. Jim made his own decisions every day and he knew the weight of them, she said. He wouldn't want you carrying that. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Danny had his eyes, he said finally. Saw him on the range during his qualification cycle. Didn't say anything because I did not know if you'd want me to. He had Jim's patience too, Vera said. That was harder to teach. They sat together in the hallway while the institution processed and documented and filed around them. It was, Vera thought, the most honest conversation she'd had in 2 years. Not because of what was said, because of what didn't need to be. When Briggs rose to leave, he paused. Ma'am, what you did last night, those security teams that were pinned. He stopped. Tried again. My nephew is on one of those teams. Vera looked at him. He's fine, Briggs said. He walked away. His voice roughened slightly. I just wanted you to know that. He left. She watched him go. Briggs found Pruitt in the hallway outside the operations center 20 minutes later. He spoke quietly the way men speak when what they are carrying is too heavy for a normal voice. He told Pruitt about Jim Ashford, about Fallujah, about the 2 tours they had served together, and what it meant that Vera had kept shooting for 20 years after losing him. He told him about Danny, that he had seen the boy qualify at this school, had recognized Jim's patience in him, had said nothing because he hadn't known whether to. Pruitt listened without interrupting. When Briggs was done, Pruitt stood in the hallway for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. She never mentioned any of it, he said quietly. No, sir, Briggs said. She never does. Pruitt looked through the window at the end of the hall toward the range. He thought about the report he had buried, about the name he had filed away and not acted on, about the 26-year-old who had died in an ambush 8 months later. He thought about Vera sitting in Station 13 in the full morning sun with a broken rifle and 3 lots of bad ammunition and a boot print on her back from someone who had already decided what she was. He walked to his office and closed the door and sat with that for a while. At 1100, Pruitt found Vera on a bench near the window that looked out over the range. He sat down beside her with the deliberateness of a man who has decided to do something he isn't entirely sure how to do. He put the notebook on the bench between them. She looked at it. The leather cover worn smooth at the corners. He had found it on the roof during the post-incident assessment. 5 names still standing tonight, he said. She looked at the notebook for a moment without picking it up. Then she picked it up, opened it to the last page, looked at the column of 6 names, Danny's crossed in red, the 5 below it intact. Her hands were not steady. She had been managing this specific moment since before dawn, keeping it behind the work, behind the debriefs, behind the operational momentum that had carried her through the morning. Now the momentum had stopped, and there was nothing left to put it behind. Danny would have been a good instructor, she said. Her voice was even. That much she had. He had patience. He got that from his father. She looked at the names. Jim had it too, more than I did, honestly. I was always the one who wanted to move faster. He'd just look at me and wait, and I'd eventually understand that the waiting was the point. Pruitt said nothing. He was giving the thing space to exist without trying to manage it into a more comfortable shape. I know you buried the report, she said. Not an accusation. A fact being named so it could be set down somewhere external to her. Yes. I need to understand why, not for the record, for me. Pruitt looked out the window, at the range empty in the morning light, at the position of Station 13. Strickland had a relationship with the deputy commandant, he said. There was pressure. I told myself the evidence wasn't complete enough. That was partially true and mostly convenient. He paused. I've been telling myself a version of that for 2 years. Danny was killed 8 months after that report. I know. I need you to understand that clearly, not abstractly. I do, he said. I will for the rest of my life. She looked at him, not with anger. She had spent the anger in those first months after Danny when there had been nothing to do with it but feel it and let it metabolize into something that could be used. What she looked at him with now was insistence. The insistence that the truth be held correctly by the people responsible for holding it. He held it. She could see that he did. She closed the notebook, put it back in her breast pocket. The 5 names, she said, make sure they're briefed, not details. Just that the threat has been removed and they should report anomalies through a channel that goes directly to Whitfield's office. They need to know someone noticed. I'll do it today. Thank you. They sat for a moment longer. Outside, a training group was moving across the near end of the range. New candidates, a different day's intake, the endless renewal of people willing to try for something difficult. What happens to you now? Pruitt asked. Sarah Calloway fails her psychological evaluation, Vera said. Unstable, possible delusional ideation discharged with medical recommendations. She disappears into civilian life. And then someone else starts somewhere else and does the next part of the work. Pruitt looked at her. Is there an end to it? When the network is gone, she said. When we stop losing people to betrayal from inside. When I can look at that list and there's nothing left to protect. She held the notebook for a moment. I don't know how long that takes, but I know what it looks like when it's done, and I'll recognize it. She stood, put her weight on the knee, which told her everything it had to say. She had heard it. Leland, he looked up. Trust your people, the ones who are left. Harwick has more in him than yesterday showed. Taggart is going to be something worth watching. Rafferty sees things that need to be seen. She looked at the range outside. This school does important work. Don't let one bad node convince you the whole system is compromised. He nodded once slowly. She walked out of the room. She left Fort Davis at 1300. Same Honda Civic, same cracked windshield. The heater made its usual negotiation with the outside temperature and eventually arrived at something adequate. She pulled out of the gate, turned onto the highway heading west, and drove without the radio. Pruitt was standing in the parking lot when she left. Not formally, not at attention. Just standing watching the car go the way people stand when they are watching something that deserves to be watched all the way out of sight. She did not look back. The road ahead was straight and flat and specific about where it was going. 14 hours to Amarillo. She had done it before. Somewhere around the first hour with Fort Davis behind her, and West Texas opening up in every direction, she reached over and set the notebook on the passenger seat. Jim's photograph was taped to the dashboard. Fallujah 2004. Danny's photograph was beside it. Both of them in the informal quality of photographs taken by people who love each other and are not thinking about documentation. She drove. At some point, she became aware that she was crying. Not dramatically. The way people cry when they are alone on a long road and the thing they have been holding finally has enough space to move. She let it happen without commentary, without the effort of not crying that she had been making for a very long time. The road was long and flat. She could see a long way ahead. She drove until the crying was done. Then she drove some more. In the glove compartment, beside the registration and a road atlas older than most of the candidates at Fort Davis, was a small metal case. Inside it, 2 rounds. The rounds she had not fired. She had carried 14 the night before and used 12, and these 2 had come home with her. She did not know exactly why she kept them. She thought she knew approximately why. The same reason she kept the notebook. The same reason she kept the photographs on the dashboard. Not as relics, as reminders of what the work was for. What specific, particular, irreplaceable thing was on the other side of all the patience and the sacrifice and the long, quiet work of being the person who stayed at it when nobody was watching. The sun moved across the sky to the west, the same direction she was driving. The afternoon light doing what West Texas afternoon light does. Long shadows, colors between gold and amber, a landscape that has no interest in being anything other than exactly what it is. She drove through it and let it be what it was. In his office at Fort Davis, Leland Pruitt sat at his desk long after the building had emptied. On the desk in front of him was a photograph, a printout from the range camera timestamped 0600 the previous morning. It showed a small woman in an oversized uniform standing at Station 13 holding a rifle that should have been retired 2 years ago, with mud still on her face from where someone had put a boot on her back. He had framed it before he went home. People asked him about it later, visitors mostly. Young officers doing their rotation through the school. They assumed it was about hazing and prevention, a cautionary image, a reminder of what not to allow. They were half right. What it was actually about was simpler than that. It was about what showed up on a Tuesday morning with a cracked windshield and duct tape on its boots and nothing to prove to anyone. What it looked like before you knew what it was. He told the young officers the most dangerous thing you will ever underestimate is a patient person with a reason. Some of them understood what he meant. The ones who didn't, he figured, would learn eventually. Most things worth knowing arrive that way. Not announced, not explained. Just present, waiting to be recognized by people who had finally done enough living to see it clearly. Out on the highway west of Fort Davis, a Honda Civic moved through the late afternoon light, steady and unhurried, going exactly where it was going. 2 photographs on the dashboard, a notebook on the passenger seat, a small metal case in the glove compartment with 2 rounds left in it, and a woman who kept her word driving 14 hours home because the work we had been done and home was where you went when the work was done for as long as home was where you were allowed to be. The road went on ahead of her. She drove.